In this video, we'll go over how to multiply radical expressions and then rationalize the denominator and work with the conjugate. So let's take a look at question number 111 on the final exam review. And we have 6 times the square root of 5 times the quantity, the square root of 11, plus the square root of 5. So I'm going to multiply the 6 square root of 5 by each term inside the parentheses using the distributive property. And I multiply the outside numbers by the outside numbers. So I have a 6 in front of the square root of 5, and there's a 1 in front of the square root of 11. So the 6 and the 1 get multiplied together, and I get 6. And then I multiply the radicals together, or the numbers under the radical together, and I have 5 times 11, and that stays under the radical, and that's the square root of 55. Now I'll distribute to the next term, and it's 6 times another 1 in front, so that's going to be a plus 6. And the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 gives me the square root of 25. And then I look to see what can I simplify. So the square root of 55, that's just 5 times 11. There's no way to break that down to a perfect square times another number, so that's just going to stay 6 times the square root of 55. And then I have 6 times the square root of 25, and since 25 is a perfect square, that's equal to 5, and I can write my final answer as 6 times the square root of 55 plus 30, and that is my final answer. Okay, let's take a look at question 112. All right, so in this one I have the square root of 7 plus the square root of 13 times the square root of 7 minus the square root of 13. So here, normally I would use FOIL. So I would do first, outer, inner, last, but I noticed that these two binomials are, well, not binomials, but they have 2 terms each. So they're kind of like binomials. And they're conjugates of each other. They're the same, just one, they have the different sign in the middle. So one is a plus b, the other one is a minus b. So I can just multiply the first terms. Square root of 7 times the square root of 7 is the square root of 49. And then multiply the last terms, and square root of 13 times the square root of 13 is going to be the square root of 169. And since one was positive and one was negative, it's a minus in front there. Square root of 49 is 7. Square root of 169 is 13. And 7 minus 13 is a negative 6. So that's my final answer for that problem. All right, let's take a look at 113. In this problem, we want to rationalize the denominator and simplify the fraction as much as possible. So I have 2 times the square root of 7 over the square root of 3, and I'm going to multiply by the denominator because I just have that one radical in the denominator. I just have one term here, so I just multiply by that same term on the top and bottom. So 2 times 1 gives me 2, and 7 times 3 is 21, and that stays under the radical. And square root of 3 times the square root of 3, I can write square root of 9, but I know that's going to be 3. So my denominator is rationalized, which just means that there's no radical there anymore. And that is my final answer. All right, let's take a look at 114. Here we want to write the conjugate of the expression. So my expression is negative 8 times the square root of 5 minus 11 times the square root of y. So the conjugate, all I have to do here, I don't have to do any rationalizing a denominator. They just gave me the one expression. So all I have to do is literally just copy that whole thing down. The only thing I'm going to do is change this minus in the middle to a plus. And everything else stays the same. And that is my answer, and that's like, how great is that question? You literally just, if it had been plus, I would have changed it to minus. That's the only thing. Don't worry about whatever sign is in front here. That's just going to carry down. Because if you start with a plus b, your conjugate is going to be a minus b. If you start with a minus b, then your conjugate is a plus b. Whatever A is, that's not going to change. It's only the sign in front of B that changes. All right. And then let's take a look at 115. Here we want to rationalize the denominator. I have square root of 5 minus the square root of 6 over square root of 5 plus the square root of 6. So my denominator is square root of 5 plus the square root of 6. I multiply by the conjugate of the denominator because it said to rationalize the denominator. If it had said rationalize the numerator, I'd be multiplying by the conjugate of the numerator. So just like in the previous question, I changed the sign. So it's going to be square root of 5 minus the square root of 6. That's because these are conjugates of each other, not because of anything involving the numerator. So I looked at the denominator and I multiplied by the conjugate of that denominator. So when I multiply the denominator by square root of 5 minus square root of 6, then I have to do the same thing to the numerator because I really don't want to change the quantity. I just want to reformat the number. So let's, oops, get rid of that, tra-la-la. Okay, so what is this going to equal? I'm going to multiply the numerators together first. I get square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is the square root of 25, which is just 5. The outer square root of 5 times minus square root of 6 is minus the square root of 30. Inner, again, I get minus square root of 30. And then the last is going to be a plus 6 because the square root of 6 times the square root of 6 gives me 6. And if you prefer to write square root of 36 and then simplify that to 6, that's fine too. All right, my denominator, I just have to do first and last again. So the first is square root of 5 times the square root of 5 is 5. And then it's going to be minus the square root of 6 times the square root of 6, which is 6. So in the numerator, I can add the 5 and 6, and I get 11, minus 2 times the square root of 30, right? Because I have a 1 here and a 1 here. It's really a minus 1 and a minus 1. That gives me a minus 2 times the square root of 30. And in the denominator, I have a minus 1. So my final answer I'm going to write as negative 11 plus 2 times the square root of 30. Because I'm just changing the signs. I'm basically rewriting this as 11 over negative 1 minus 2 square root of 30 over negative 1. And so 11 over negative 1 gives me negative 11, and the two negatives make a positive for the 2 square root of 30. So this is my final answer.